Title: Midnight Curse. The mansion was quiet. Too quiet. Cinderella stood at the grand staircase, her breath shallow, ears straining to hear any sign of life in the enormous house. But all she could hear was the ticking. That horrible, unrelenting ticking of the massive clock in the foyer. Cinderella had never returned to her old home after her marriage to the prince. Why would she? The sprawling estate had only ever been a prison to her, ruled by the cold cruelty of her stepmother, Lady Tremaine. But when she received a mysterious letter written in her stepmother's hand, her curiosity and sense of guilt drew her back. The letter was short and cryptic. Midnight approaches. If you value your life, come home. It had been years since Cinderella had walked through the grand doors of the mansion, but nothing had changed. The same cold marble floors, the same suffocating air of dread. Only now, the house was empty. No sign of her stepsisters, no servants, not even a whisper of life. Just the ticking of the massive clock in the foyer, looming over everything like a judge counting down to an inevitable doom. Cinderella crept through the darkened hallways, candlelight flickering in her hand. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the house itself was watching her. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump. Every shadow seemed to shift as if something unseen was moving within them. "Stepmother?" she called, her voice trembling. "Anastasia? Drizella?" No answer. As she ascended the staircase, her foot snagged on something, a broken shard of glass. Her breath caught in her throat. It was part of her glass slipper, shattered into pieces. But how? She hadn't worn them since that night at the ball. She bent down, picking up a shard, her reflection staring back at her from the glass. But the reflection? It wasn't hers. A twisted, deformed version of her stepmother stared back at her from the shard, eyes glowing with malice. Cinderella dropped it with a gasp, the glass shattering into dust at her feet. Suddenly, a chilling voice echoed through the hall. "You never should have come back." Cinderella ran, her heart pounding, as the clock's ticking grew louder, filling the house with its dreadful rhythm. She stumbled through the dark corridors, the layout of the house feeling alien, unfamiliar. The walls seemed to stretch and twist, hallways that should have led to familiar rooms now spiraling into endless darkness. Then she saw it. Lady Tremaine. Or what was left of her. Her stepmother stood at the far end of the hall, her form shrouded in shadow. But something was wrong. Her figure was twisted, her limbs unnaturally long, her face a grotesque parody of the woman she once knew. Her eyes burned with an eerie light, and in her hands she held a glowing pocket watch, its face cracked and distorted. "You thought you could escape, Cinderella," Lady Tremaine hissed, her voice distorted as though coming from deep within a well. "But time catches up to all of us." Cinderella backed away, heart racing. She had to think. She had to survive. But how could she escape a house that seemed alive, with a monster that controlled time itself? She remembered the clock, the massive grandfather clock in the foyer. It had always been the center of her stepmother's power. Lady Tremaine was obsessed with it, her life ruled by its ticking, her punishments always meted out on time. Maybe, just maybe, the clock was the key. Cinderella darted through the twisting halls, her feet bare and bloodied from the broken glass that littered the floors. Lady Tremaine's distorted laughter echoed behind her, the sound growing closer with each tick of the clock. As she reached the foyer, she saw it. The massive clock towered over her, its pendulum swinging ominously, counting down the seconds to midnight. And then, in the glass face of the clock, she saw her stepmother's reflection again, twisted and monstrous, grinning with sadistic glee. "You'll never escape," Lady Tremaine's voice hissed in her ear, though she was nowhere to be seen. Cinderella's mind raced. She had to stop the clock, break the curse. She grabbed the pendulum, trying to halt its movement, but it was impossibly heavy. The clock's ticking grew louder, more aggressive, as though it was fighting against her. Suddenly, a shadow loomed behind her. Lady Tremaine, now a monstrous spectral figure, lunged toward her. Cinderella dodged, her instincts sharp, and in that moment, she noticed something, a hidden keyhole at the base of the clock. Her slipper, the shard of glass she had picked up earlier. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a key. With trembling hands, Cinderella shoved the glass shard into the keyhole. The clock's ticking became deafening, vibrating through the very walls of the mansion. Lady Tremaine screeched, her figure distorting and melting as the hands of the clock moved closer to midnight. Cinderella twisted the shard, and with a loud, resounding the clock stopped. Time froze. Lady Tremaine let out a final, blood-curdling scream as her form dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only an echo of her twisted laughter. The mansion was silent. The oppressive weight lifted from the air. The shadows seemed to retreat, and the halls, once dark and twisted, returned to their normal state. The clock stood frozen, its hands permanently stopped at midnight. Cinderella stood alone in the foyer, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The nightmare was over. She had survived. But as she looked at the shattered remains of her glass slipper, she knew that something had changed. She wasn't the same girl who had once been saved by a fairy godmother. This time, she had saved herself. And somewhere, in the deep, dark corners of the house, the faintest echo of the clock's ticking began once more.